Hi, I'm Nicole Naditz. I am a lifelong language learner of both English and French, and for about 25 years, I was a French teacher. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about hacking the interpretive mode. So, the first thing to think about if you're working on improving your skills in the interpretive mode is to understand what we mean by the interpretive mode. What kind of task is a task that's in the interpretive mode? Well, the interpretive mode is all about how you, the user, interpret the information that has been prepared by the author or creator of the document, so that you can tell if you are understanding the message the way it was intended. And a document doesn't have to be something written. So when I talk about a document or an authentic document, I'm talking about anything that was originally prepared for a native speaker audience. And that could be a song, a poem, a newspaper article, a video, a podcast, a story. There are so many kinds of documents that you could be interacting with. But the key is that in the case of these authentic documents, meaning that they were originally prepared for native speakers of the language, it is all about what you interpret. And that means that you are engaging in an activity where the communication is one way only. You are receiving information and language from these documents that this author created, and you don't have the opportunity to contact the person who wrote the song or who created the video or who wrote the article in order to confirm or check or clarify your understanding. You just have to go with what you see and what you understand. And interpretation, or the interpretive mode, isn't just about comprehending individual words or even comprehending strings of words. It's more about a combination of your comprehension, but also your ability to interpret what occurs between the lines. That comes from not just an understanding of a wide range of vocabulary, but also from your ability to use what you know about the cultural perspectives of the person or people who created this text in order to help inform your understanding. And when someone is engaging in an interpretive task, what you'll see them doing is reading something, listening to something, or viewing something either live or via video. So one of the first things I'm going to talk about kind of separately is one particular thing you can do to improve your listening comprehension. Then we'll move on to a series of strategies you can do whether you are listening to an authentic document or reading an authentic document. For listening tasks, your understanding of the sounds of the language is critical. You have to know the code of the language, the code that transforms the written word into the spoken word. That is your ability to decode as you read, right? If you thought about yourself reading out loud, how close would you sound to a native speaker? Not just in terms of your pronunciation of isolated words, but also your intonation, kind of the musicality of the language as you go from sentence to sentence. Knowing the sounds of the language actually will improve your listening comprehension a great deal. And one way that a difference or disparity between a new learner in the language and a more fluent speaker or even a native speaker becomes apparent is with the pronunciation, of course. So one thing that learners of language can do is continue to work on their pronunciation. And the reason for that is if your pronunciation is significantly different from a native speaker, even a word that you normally would recognize if you saw it written down will seem foreign to you when the native speaker says it, because the way you are saying it and the way you are seeing the sounds of the language and how they correspond to the written word actually is just too different from what that looks like for a native speaker. So, for example, as someone who speaks French, I know the rules of the language for vowels, for consonants, for what happens when you put two different vowels together, and so on. And so when I see bibliothèque, I pronounce it the way the French people do. as opposed to perhaps a newer learner of language who is a speaker of English who looks at it and says bibliotheki. And because they say it that way, they aren't going to recognize a native speaker saying bibliothèque as a word that they totally understand. That word means library, by the way. But because there's a mismatch between what happens when they see this word and they say it out loud in their head and what happens when a native speaker sees the word and the native speaker says it out loud, it seems like two completely different words, and that can really impact your listening comprehension. So one thing you can do to improve or at least continue to work on your pronunciation is actually to use the technology tools you have available. For example, you can set the voice typing language on your phone or computer to the target language and actually dictate messages to it. So your text messaging can be changed to almost any language. If you have Google Drive and you use something like Google Docs, you can actually turn on the voice typing to be in another language and then try dictating sentences and watch what happens in your text messaging platform or on that Google Doc to see if the artificial intelligence that replicates a native speaker's understanding actually understands you correctly. That can help highlight patterns of error in your pronunciation where there are certain words that consistently come out incorrectly because of a particular phoneme or sound of the language that you're still learning to develop. Another thing you can do if you have an iPhone, for example, is actually talk to Siri in the native language and ask Siri questions. If Siri answers you appropriately, you know that you are speaking in a way that is comprehensible to a native speaker. Now we're going to talk about some good interpreting skills, regardless of whether the task involves listening, writing, or even viewing a video. And these are skills that people who are successful readers, for example, do all the time naturally in their heads. We don't want to forget to do those in our new languages as well, because they can really take our understanding to a whole new level. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is for those of you who started learning language later, or even just now you're older than you were as a young child, even if you started learning the language then, don't discount the value of your life experience. Using, again, the example of people who start learning a language when they reach high school, they often hear about the brain science, which does say that high school is not the best time to learn a new language because our brains are wired to learn language when we are very, very young. And although that is true, there are a couple of advantages to being older when you learn language. And one of them is that you can actually use your life experience to help you as you encounter something new in the target language. And that would not be possible for a young child who simply does not have that array of life experience. Another thing you can do is be sure to use structural cues that are part of the document. For example, if it's a written document, look at everything that is available in that text. Are there pictures? Are there headers or headlines or sections of text that are darker than others? Take a look at those. Use those to help you get a sense of the overall purpose of that document, as well as what perhaps a couple of details might exist in there. Ask yourself questions as you listen and ask yourself questions as you read. This is actually, again, a strategy that successful readers do naturally, but you don't hear them doing it because they do it inside their head while they're reading or while they're listening. The questions can be comprehension questions. Wow, that's a new word. I wonder what that means. I haven't seen that word before. I wonder if I will see the word again and understand it better next time I see it. But they can also be questions about the purpose, about what will happen next, about almost anything about the document, because by asking yourself questions, your brain actually starts activating aspects of the brain that are designed to kind of look deeper for answers, and that can help support your comprehension. The other thing you want to do is make connections. So if you start noticing that you're seeing a comparison or a connection between something in the document and an experience you've already had, that's a good thing. That actually supports your understanding. So that connection could be to something you learned in school, something you read in another document, something you heard on a podcast, something you experienced in a video game, something you saw in a movie, or just something you experienced yourself in your own life. But making connections and asking questions are two of the key strategies that successful readers use in every language in order to promote their understanding. A third strategy that good readers use regularly is making predictions. As they begin a new document and also as they proceed through a document, they naturally find themselves predicting what they think will happen. And even if the prediction is wrong, it still helps their brain to better understand the words and phrases that they're encountering, because it wires the brain to look deeper and have a better sense of what's happening between the lines. So it's okay if your prediction turns out to not be true. Just the fact that your brain was seeking the follow-up information to decide whether that prediction was going to be true or not supports your understanding. Another great strategy is to visualize while you read. This isn't necessarily something you would need so much on video, because on video you already have visual cues. You might need it a little bit in listening, but it's particularly helpful with reading. You want to almost see a picture in your mind as you read. This can actually help you fill in details and gaps and help you know where you're understanding and where you're not. If there are any sequencing words, pay attention to them. Sequencing words are things like first, then, next. Determine whose voices are included and whose voices are excluded. Now, this is more for kind of more robust texts that maybe provide one opinion or viewpoint on a topic. They can also be evident in articles, news, journalistic items, podcasts. It can be very helpful to determine kind of the point of view that's being presented, and then ask yourself what points of view are not being represented and why. As we look at these strategies, something else I'd like to bring up is that really this is your session. So if you would like to pause the video at this point and go get a document and actually try out some of these strategies, that could actually be a really good way to start building in kind of some muscle memory in your brain for doing these things as you read or listen to something. Then you can always come back and resume the video. And as I already alluded to, determining the author's purpose really is part of determining whose voices are included and excluded in those texts that are longer, that are presenting one side, or even stating that they present both sides of a story, an opinion on something, or who are texts that are trying to persuade you of something. So what happens when you encounter a word you don't know? One of the things that you can do is have a strategy for what to do when you hit a new word and you realize you really don't understand it. So I recommend that you break it down. The first thing you want to do is decide, is that word even needed? Can I continue for now and use my other strategies that we've talked about today, and still be able to get kind of the main idea and my details without that word? Now, if that's the case, the word is not needed, then by all means, move on, right? But if you're pretty convinced that you actually need this word in order to understand the main ideas, there are a few other things you might want to try. If that word is needed, the first thing to look at is there any chance it's a cognate with one of the languages you already know? Meaning, is it a word that is similar enough to a word in your native language that you could tell what it means by looking at it? And if so, does that word make sense in the context of what you're reading or listening to? This is also, earlier I was talking about the importance of pronunciation. If you're listening and you hear a new word, the strength of your pronunciation will make it easier for you to write down a brand new word when you hear it, so that you can decide later if you need to look it up. And you'll be more likely to be accurate in spelling it correctly the first time, so that you'll have greater success when you try to look up that unknown word that you heard in an audio podcast or in a song. Whereas if your pronunciation is still struggling to be at that level, you will have a much harder time listening to an unknown or new word and writing it down accurately enough to get a definition. If it is a word you need in order to understand what's happening in that document, to understand the main idea or even the key details, another place you can go is to look at the root of the word and decide if it belongs to a word family that you are familiar with, right? So looking at the root means looking at the part of the word that kind of contains the meaning. The part, for example, in the word speaking, speak is the root. Ing is just a gerund that's added to the end to kind of provide some time in terms of when a person is speaking. So sometimes a new word will actually be built off of a word you already know, but it just has a different prefix or a different suffix, or maybe a new verb ending you've never seen before in a Romance language, for example. So check for those word families by looking at try to find the base of the word and separate it from any prefixes or suffixes, any beginnings or endings, to see if you can get at the core of what the word means. And then are there context clues? So are there sequencing words? So let's say it is a word and it turns out it's just a word you haven't seen spelled this way, but it's just another way of saying that it's in the past. And you can tell that because there's a context clue in the sentence that says yesterday. And you've figured out that it's something to do with a verb you recognize. And you just didn't recognize exactly the way it was spelled. But now you can tell that it's in the past and you think it probably means saying, for example. So these are all things that you can do when you encounter a word you don't know. Now, if you're not actually taking a test at the time that this happens, let's say you go through all of those steps and you've determined that you need the word. In fact, it keeps coming up, and every time it comes up, you go through these steps. Okay, it's still not a cognate. It's not in the word family. Do the context clues when I see that word again help me? Maybe they'll help me the second time or the third time, right? Because I keep seeing it. As I said, if it's not a test, once you've gone through all those steps and you still don't understand it and you're pretty sure you need it, that's when you want to go to a reliable dictionary or online dictionary, such as wordreference.com, and actually look it up. Obviously, you can't do that while you're taking a test, but it is perfectly okay to do that if you have already gone through this entire process that's outlined here. It is a word that you need. You can't understand it based on it being a cognate with your own language. You can't figure it out based on word family. You can't use the context clues or even the parts of the word, right? If you know certain beginnings of word always mean not, like in the English, undo, unknown, right? And you know those for that language, and you've tried everything you know. You've tried looking at those beginning parts of the word, those prefixes. You've tried looking at the root of the word. You've tried looking at the endings, and you're just stuck. That's when you want to look it up. If it's a word that's not needed at all, whether or not you need to look it up is really just more for your own curiosity, as opposed to being something that you would always want to focus on. You really don't want to try to look up every single unknown word. That doesn't actually turn out to be a great way to improve your interpreting skills. So, for example, if you looked at an authentic document like this one, now this one is in French and you may not speak French, but you want to try to use some of the strategies we've talked about. You want to look at how it's organized. You want to look at which words are drawn out in a different way than other words. You want to use your life experience to look at the graphics in the background and the graphics in the foreground. And you want to use those images and graphics to support your understanding. You want to look at the words, particularly the words that kind of stand out on their own, and see if they are familiar to you because they are cognates with English or with another language that you speak fluently. And then you want to kind of use all of that information together to try to figure out what this document is trying to present for you. There's a reason it's organized the way it is. There's a reason the images are underneath each of those little text boxes. You want to use all of those things to support your understanding. So again, I really encourage you to actually stop the video or even rewind it and pause the video. Go grab a document of your own in your target language and try using some of those strategies to support your understanding, especially when it comes to understanding main ideas and details, and working with new words that you haven't seen before. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful time at the rest of Global C.R.E.D.